Fish 22. Illegitimate governances. Unlawful dominion. In the preceding chapter, it was proven beyond any semblance of a doubt that an actual, patriarchal monarch, that is, a genuine, saintly king, as defined in that chapter, is the solitary class of human who is qualified to rule a nation, just as lesser societal units, such as nuclear families, extended families, clans, tribes, villages, towns, and cities, are best governed by their respective patriarchs. Therefore, logically, any system of administration other than one controlled by a naturally arisen patriarch is inherently evil, wicked, illegal, illegitimate, criminal, and Adamic. Also, turn to chapters 25 and 26, in order to learn the reasons why the concept of matriarchy is not only Adamic, but downright farcical. Socialism, communism. Socialism is a political and economic system of societal organization, in which natural resources, property, and the means of production are owned in common, controlled by the collective public, but typically by a cooperative, the state, or the government, as opposed to private ownership by individuals and/or business corporations. Socialism is based on the notion that common or public ownership of resources and means of production leads to a more equal society. It is a stage of society in Marxist theory, transitional between capitalism and communism, and distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work done. Hence, communism is an extreme form of socialism that strives for both social and economic equality, something that can never be achieved, since true equality can never ever exist in the ontic world. Socialism, and communism, is best defined in contrast with capitalism, or to be more accurate, with free market economies, as socialism has arisen both as a critical challenge to capitalism, and as a proposal for overcoming and replacing it. Cf. Capitalism, in the glossary of this book. Socialism, communism is intrinsically evil, because it is based on an ideology of both social and economic egalitarianism, which is a practical impossibility, if not a theoretical impossibility. Equality exists solely in abstract concepts, such as mathematics, and arguably within the atomic and subatomic realms. Many proponents of socialism argue that it is purely an economic system, and therefore, independent of any particular form of governance. However, it is inconceivable that socialism, communism could be implemented on a nationwide scale, without any form of government intervention. If a certain number of persons wish to unite, in order to form a commune or a worker cooperative, it is indeed their prerogative, but it could never work in a country with a large population, because there will always exist entrepreneurs desirous of engaging in wealth-building enterprises. Even a musician who composes and records a hit tune wants his song to succeed and earn him substantial wealth. As mentioned above, despite socialists, communists maintaining that the twisted ideologies are purely economic systems, it is very difficult, if not outright impossible, to divorce them from the political sphere, because socialism depends on a governing power to organize society in a very meticulous manner. In any case, assuming that socialism is nothing more than a form of economic organization, simply for the fact that it overtly precludes any kind of free market exchange, the latter of which is objectively moral, or at worst, amoral, see Chapter 12, socialism and communism must not be imposed on any community or nation, according to the principles of Sanatana Dharma. At worst, socialism and/or communism is a truly horrific, tyrannical, totalitarian, murderous regime that leads to untold pain and misery, due to certain dogmas that are intrinsically associated with Marxism, particularly a ferocious hostility towards all things dharmic, especially the freedom of religious practice. Witless Marxists enjoy using the terms capitalism and imperialism in rather inaccurate and emotive ways, in order to emphasize their presumably wicked natures. I would wager that the main motivation for Karl Marx, as well as the multitude of vassals to his caustic ideology, hatred for free market economies, is simply out of envy for the business class. There is very little doubt in my mind that if Herr Marx and his evil acolytes had somehow found themselves with a healthy bank balance, they would have invested their financial resources in some kind of profitable enterprise, such as establishing a business or investing in company shares or stocks, rather than distributing their wealth among the poor masses, which would be more in keeping with their inane, egalitarian principles. If you think otherwise, then you are truly deluded, and think too highly of that parasite, Marx, who, for his sustenance, solicited funds from his friends, instead of earning an honest living as a writer. Socialism reduces individual citizens to utilities, who, in practice, are used to support the ruling elite, who are invariably despotic scoundrels, and very far from ideal leaders, i.e., compassionate and righteous monarchs. Those citizens who display talent in business or the arts are either oppressed, or the gifts are coercively utilized by the corrupt state. Despite purporting to be a fair and equitable system of wealth distribution, those in leadership positions seem to live a far more luxurious lifestyle than the mass of menial workers. Wealth is effectively stolen from the rich. Most destructively, virtuous and holy teachings, Dharma, in Sanskrit, are repressed by the irreligious and illegitimate government. The argument that some form of government welfare program is essential to aid those who are unable to financially support themselves, for reasons beyond their control, is fallacious. A righteous ruler, i.e., a saintly monarch, will ensure the welfare of each and every citizen, by encouraging private welfare. There is no need for a king to extort resources from his subjects, in order to feed and clothe the impoverished. Of course, in the highly unlikely event that civilians are unwilling to help a human in dire straits, the king would intervene to assist that person, as one would expect from a patriarch, father of his people. The head of any nation ought to be the penultimate patriarch, not a selfish buffoon. Democracy. Democracy is almost as evil as socialism, because, just as the rabble favored the murderous Barabbas over the good King Jesus, the ignorant masses will vote, overwhelmingly, for the candidate who promises to fulfill their petty desires, rather than one who will enforce the law, and promote a wholesome and just society. Read Chapter 12, for the most authoritative and concise exegesis of law and ethics, currently available. Unlike socialism, in which wealth is stolen from the rich and distributed to the poor, with a little bit extra for the ruling elite, democratic governments frequently steal money from the working class via the taxation system, and distribute it to the already affluent, often indirectly. Even in the miraculous scenario where the vast majority of the population are holy and righteous citizens, it is still immoral for them to vote for a seemingly righteous leader. This is because that leader will not be, by definition, a king. As clearly and logically explicated in the previous chapter of this sole holy scripture, monarchy is the only lawful form of governance. If an elected ruler is truly righteous, he will not be able to condone the fact that the citizens are paying him to perform a job, which is a working class role, and that an inordinate amount of time, money, and resources are being wasted on political campaigning. Furthermore, an actual ruler does not wimpishly pander to voters. He takes power by divinely mandated force, as one would expect from the penultimate alpha male in society, the ultimate alpha male being a priest. The thought of children voting for who will be their parents or their teachers would seem utterly ridiculous to the average person, yet most believe that they are qualified to choose their own ruler. They are most assuredly not. Just as a typical child fails to understand that a piece of sweet, juicy, nutritious, delicious fruit is more beneficial for them than a cone of pus-infested, fattening, diabetes-inducing ice cream, so too can the uneducated proletariat not understand that they are unqualified to choose their own leader, even after it is logically explained to them, as it is in this chapter, as well as in the previous chapter. And, by uneducated, it is simply meant that they are misguided in the realities of life and in Dharma, righteous living, not in facts and figures, nor in technical training. Wisdom doesn't necessarily correlate with intelligence. No democratic, or socialist, government will educate its citizens sufficiently well, that those citizens will acquire knowledge of how to usurp their regime. To put it frankly, democracy is ruled by the lowest common denominator. One who requires the services of a brain surgeon will naturally seek the most qualified physician to perform the operation, so logically, we ought to accept the sovereignty of the most qualified man to rule over an entire nation, a genuine king. Furthermore, true democracy is impossible in practice. See the entry, Democracy, in the glossary of what is, by far, the most important work of literature ever composed, this holy scripture, a final instruction sheet for humanity. Anarchy. Anarchy is a state in which there are no rulers. It is a rejection of hierarchy. The earliest recorded use of the word, from the early 16th century, simply meant absence of government, albeit with the implication of civil disorder. A similar but ameliorated meaning began to be employed in the 19th century, Christian era, in reference to a utopian, that is, an idealistic, society that had no government. The English term was borrowed from the medieval Latin, anarchia, borrowed, in turn, from the Greek word, anarchia, lack of a leader, lawlessness, from ornarchos, without a head or chief. Leaderless, from an, plus, archos, derivative of archos, leader, chief, plus, ear. It should be obvious that anarchy can never ever succeed, because even the smallest possible social unit, i.e. the nuclear family, requires a dominator. Any family will fall apart without a strict male household head. Factually speaking, without the husband, father, there is no family, by definition. The English noun, husband, comes from the Old Norse word, husbandi, meaning, master of the house. A family is deficient without its head, just as a body without its head is incomplete. The same paradigm applies to the extended family, which depends on a strong patriarchal figure, customarily, the eldest or most senior male. Likewise, with clans, tribes, villages, towns, cities, and nations or countries. Unfortunately, there are many otherwise intelligent persons who honestly believe that an entire country can smoothly function without a leader in place. Any sane person can easily understand that even a nuclear family is unable to function properly without a head of the house, what to speak of a populous nation. The reason for anarchists' distrust of any kind of government is due to the corrupt nature of democratic governments, and the grave adulteration of the monarchy in recent centuries. However, if anarchists were to understand that almost all so-called kings, queens, in recent centuries, were not even close to being true monarchs, they may change their stance on that inane system. Those abject fools who advocate for some kind of anarchistic society should be required to adhere to their own asinine ideology within the private domains. So, for example, a man who desires the absence of any form of national leadership really ought to consent to that very same template upon his own family. He should not presume to be the head of his household, but rather, permit his wife and children to become his equals. Likewise, a housewife ought not rule over her children, an employer must not direct the actions of his employees, and so on, and so forth. Thereafter, it will become blatantly obvious that any form of anarchy cannot endure, assuming, of course, that in the case of a father, his household is not already fractured, which seems to be the case in most families, due to lax leadership as a consequence of poor government, crooked education, and feminism, which has as its not so tacit goal of destroying all forms of patriarchal structures, starting from the nuclear family. How unfortunate it is that anarchists usually can see the need for a hierarchical structure within their own domains, such as those mentioned above, yet quite impervious to the necessity of a strong regime on the national level. The hypocrisy is astounding. And for those idiots who would contend, it is okay for me to be the head of my family, but there should not be a government ruling over me, that is not a logical argument, but merely an unjustified, emotive assertion, motivated by the fact that we humans have not been governed by a legitimate regime for at least a couple of centuries. Of course, this is not to imply that every monarch in ancient history was a holy and righteous king, or even an actual king, by definition, but the fact that we humans have survived this long, suggests that they were not the kind of demonic, evil, murderous, thieving scoundrels who have ruled over every single country and nation on the planet during the past few hundred years or so. Following are two imaginary dialectic exercises that demonstrate the stupidity of those abject fools who advocate for anarchy. One such fool is a man who does not accept the paradigm that men ought to lead their families, whilst the other abject fool holds the antithetical position. First dialectic. Anarchist. I firmly believe that all governments are corrupt, and that anarchy is the only legitimate system of societal organization. Teacher. Firstly, I am not convinced that the concept of anarchy would, or even could, include the fact of organization, but be that as it may. Do you accept the obvious fact that human societies and civilizations are founded upon the nuclear family unit? Anarchist. I think so, yes. As you stated, it is a rather obvious fact. Of course, individuals are the foundation of the family, correct? Teacher. Of course that's true, but the basic societal unit is the nuclear family, a man, his wife, and their children, if and when they come. Anarchist. Okay, I can accept that. I won't mention homosexual couples at this stage, since we might undertake a tangential discourse. Teacher. Briefly, homosexual couples are unable to expand as a unit, since procreation can't result, but let us leave that for another time. Anarchist. Certainly. Teacher. So, in your considered opinion, who do you believe ought to be the head of the nuclear family unit, and the extended family unit? Anarchist. Well, as an egalitarian, I believe that men and women are equal, so a husband and wife ought to be joint leaders in their family. Teacher. In that case, it seems that we have reached an impasse since, if you believe such an erroneous thing, there is no hope for you, sad to say. The only thing left for me to say is, you desperately need to read the holiest of holy scriptures, a final instruction sheet for humanity, in which it is proven beyond any doubt whatsoever, that equality is non-existent outside the quantum and conceptual spheres. And because of this self-evident truism, just as with our closest relatives, the great apes, adult males have evolved to naturally serve as the leaders of their families, their extended families, and furthermore, their clans, tribes, villages, towns, cities, and nations, or in modern terms, their countries, too. At the risk of hurting your feelings, any man who believes that their womenfolk are in any way equal to themselves in authority, leadership, are truly pathetic excuses for men, and deserves everything that comes their way as a result of their wimpish ideology, such as being nagged or henpecked by the bossy daughters, wives, and mothers. Anarchist. Wow, that was quite offensive, wouldn't you agree? Anyway, I shall look into the publication to which you referred, perhaps. Teacher. I sincerely hope so, for the future of our species fully depends on adhering to what is known as Dharma, and the viewpoint to which you subscribe, namely egalitarianism, and I would wager, other leftist ideologies, since it is practically impossible to find a human being in the present age who is genuinely conservative in all his or her ways, is the death knell of humanity, truth be told. And incidentally, you claim to be an egalitarian, yet when I asked you who should act as the family leader, I noticed that you totally overlooked the children, so your logic is rather flawed. Is there any logical, as opposed to any valid, reason for precluding children? Anarchist. Obviously, it would be impractical for a young child to act as the head of a household. You won't catch me obeying my kids. Teacher. Exactly. That is a valid reason, yet not a logical one, according to the concept of egalitarianism, which implies that each individual human is intrinsically equal in some fashion, in authority, in this particular case. And this is the reason why I assert that the wife, too, must not act as the leader of a family. Hopefully, that will become clear upon carefully analyzing latter chapters of FISH. Anarchist. Fine. Second dialectic. Anarchist. Anarchy is the only way to freedom, for our civilization. Teacher. What is so wrong with the concept, or the convention, of government? Anarchist. Governments, without exception, are nothing but a means for the elite to subjugate the masses. They are nothing but evil. Teacher. Does that include an actual, meaning, a legitimate, monarchy? Anarchist. Are you serious? Of course. Kings are possibly the most tyrannical form of governance. Teacher. It seems you failed to closely listen to my previous question, since you seem to have ignored the terms, actual, and legitimate. Anarchist. What does it matter? All monarchs are tyrannical dictators, who oppress their so-called subjects. Name a single good king. Teacher. First of all, if you would care to carefully study chapters 21 and 22 of what is, by far, the most important work of literature ever composed, a final instruction sheet for humanity, you might possibly change your stance on that matter. Anyhow, let me ask you this very simple question. Do you consider that a man, that is, the husband, father, ought to be the head of his own household? Anarchist. Of course. What kind of so-called man, worthy of the term, would even dream of kowtowing to a mere female? Definitely not I. Teacher. And likewise, the eldest male, such as a grandfather or great-grandfather, should be the natural leader of his extended family, clan. Anarchist. That seems correct, yes. My own clan, the MacArthur clan, is headed by our beloved grandfather, Mr. Reginald John MacArthur. Despite the fact that the MacArthur clan has several grandfathers, Reginald has proven himself to be the natural head of our clan. Teacher. Now, think carefully about this next question. Who should be the leader or the ruler of a village, and likewise, a town or a city? Anarchist. Shouldn't a city or a nation vote for their leader or ruler, or else, there ought to be no ruler, since anarchy is true freedom? Teacher. Can you not see that you have broken your own paradigm? If a man is naturally the head of his family, extended family, and clan, shouldn't the head of a town or city, and thereafter, an entire nation or country, be the natural leader of that metropolis? Anarchist. I think I now see what you mean, but how will a man, in practice, become the leader of a city-state, or of a nation or a country? Teacher. Have you ever wondered how those institutions began in the first instance? Obviously, as human populations enlarged to the point where we began to establish populous villages, towns, cities, and nations, there would naturally arise those qualified males who would assert their natural authority, just as it is superlatively natural for a man, such as yourself, to assert his dominion over his family. Such men were usually the head of the military, since even small villages require warriors to protect their inhabitants from external threats, or else the head of a martial arts dojo, and came to be known as kings, monarchs, emperors, or similar monikers. Anarchist. It is inconceivable to me that any single human, even an exceedingly domineering alpha male, could possibly overtake any large populace in our day and age, except perhaps in one of those rare societies that are either Islamic, or else, some small island nation. Teacher. True. That's the reason why human society must inevitably crumble, before genuine kings can usurp the present world hegemony. Anarchist. Oh my God. I think you may be correct. I will have to contemplate this a little more, so please let me get back to you sometime. Teacher. No problem. Whatever you do, very carefully study the holiest of holy scriptures, the book that I mentioned previously, not only once or twice, but several times, because this planet desperately needs more actual monarchists, and of course, actual monarchs. Anarchist. I definitely will do so, because I pride myself on holding the most ethical and correct position on various important issues of life. Teacher. Great. Even if anarchy was a dharmic, that is, legitimate, form of societal organization, it would never survive more than a very brief period of time, because there will invariably arise at least one person, typically, the most dominant alpha male, who will attempt to seize control of his own community or the nation, country. This is due to the fact that human beings, like most animal species, including our nearest biological relatives, the apes, are an inherently hierarchical species, and never will there exist a time and place where a strictly egalitarian paradigm will persevere. Therefore, ultimately, any discussion of anarchy as a tenable institution is a complete and utter waste of valuable time and energy. The perils of non-monarchical governance. Most of the problems in human society are directly or indirectly attributable to this relatively modern phenomenon, non-monarchies, since it is the government's role and sacred duty to enforce the law, see Chapter 12, and non-monarchical governments are themselves unlawful. One of the many sinister characteristics of democracy, socialism, and other evil forms of governance, is the desire for their so-called leaders to control, or at least influence, the private lives of every single citizen, hence the term nanny state. For example, in the wicked, decadent nations in which this holy scripture was composed, the Philippine Islands and the Southland, or Australia, as it is known in the Latin tongue, the demonic governments try, and largely succeed, in thwarting the rights of parents to properly raise, discipline and punish their children according to their own mores *, compulsory vaccination of infants, enforcing feminist ideology, limiting rightful powers an employer has over his servants, subsidizing animal agriculture, persecuting religious leaders, even to imprisonment and death, believe it or not. Personally, I have been jailed thrice for executing God's perfect and pure will, and even trying to negatively influence what its people eat and what they wear. Obviously, this ought not imply that parents are permitted to cause undue harm to their children, but as clearly explicated in Chapter 12, if authentic Dharma is promulgated throughout society, any parental wrongdoing will be dealt with via the natural system of policing. It is simply impossible for a king to oversee and regulate the activities of each of his subjects, even if the population of his kingdom was relatively small. Of course, the typical reader will wonder why the words king and/or monarch are used so often in this holiest of all holy books, when there has not existed a genuine monarch on this planet for centuries. If, on the other hand, the terms prime minister and/or president were used instead, it could be seen to lend legitimacy to any non-monarchical form of governance, and thus misleading the reader in a serious way. Above, it is not being argued that a government should not control what its citizens wear in public, but the authorities should ensure that they are modestly dressed, according to the guidelines outlined in Chapter 28, which is hardly the case in Australia, the Philippines, and similar nations. At least 99% of Filipinas, for instance, are transvestinal, despite Philippines pretending to be a religious nation. Again, the actual regulation of such matters is more easily accomplished by the citizens themselves, provided that genuine Dharma is propagated throughout the nation, especially if the nation is definitionally a nation, and not just a country. See the glossary entries for those two terms. Basically, the worst of the non-monarchical governments promote, or at least permit, all things contrary to God's perfect and pure will, or, for those who disbelieve in the deity, and more accurately, all things contrary to objective morality and Dharma, read chapters 07 and 12 in this regard, such as adultery, fornication, prostitution, transvestism, pornography, homosexuality, bestiality, gambling, even conducting lotteries themselves, unlawful abortion of poor, innocent, unborn children, the factory farming of equally poor, innocent, defenseless animals, not to mention any unjustified animal abuse whatever, irreligion, drug addiction, disrespect for authority, and advancing materialism and nescience, via a powerful network of institutions of mass education, that is, so-called kindergartens, schools, colleges, and universities. Their aim is to produce a population of indoctrinated citizens, who have been conditioned to serve the state, and its evil, nefarious agendas. Even though non-monarchical leaders are committing a criminal act by ordering the persecution of its citizens, or instigating war on another nation, the police and military personnel who execute their orders are equally, if not more, guilty of the despicable deeds. Even if a non-monarchical government punishes a criminal, that in itself is a criminal act, because it has absolutely no authority to do so. That is akin to a baby punishing its mother for theft, when it is actually the role of the infant's father to enact disciplinary action upon the woman in question. Yet again, the 12th chapter of this most important book of all explains how one may determine what human actions are factually immoral. Planetary hegemony. For the past few centuries, most of the Earth has been, illegitimately, controlled by a cabal of wicked men, comprising of extremely wealthy businessmen and oligarchs, particularly bankers, and so-called religious leaders, those who command a huge following. Ironically, some of these elite businessmen instigate a pseudo-socialist government within their nations, so that they themselves can control the financial system for their selfish gain. This hegemony came about during the transition between the equally illegitimate, so-called monarchs of old, and the present-day so-called democracy, republican structures. Any nation still ruled by a king is not ruled by any semblance of a genuine king. For example, at the time of writing, the so-called king of Thailand approved of so-called marriage between two members of the same gender. Furthermore, with allusion to democracy, the most powerful country on earth has elected an absent-minded, geriatric fool to be their leader. It seems patently obvious to me that, in the case of any apocalyptic event in which there is a breakdown in the normal governmental control systems, such as nuclear devastation, a catastrophic natural disaster, or any similar world-changing incident, there will arise those rare males who will seize power over the remaining populations. Such alpha males are called chiefs, kings, or monarchs. See the previous chapter. This planet is surely doomed, unless the most pernicious institutions ever known to man, democracy, socialism and communism, are replaced with the only legitimate form of government, monarchy, ideally a holy monarch, though even a mediocre king is preferable to being ruled by an elected official or a sociopathic megalomaniac, who could almost never be a righteous ruler. It is not a coincidence that those societies, nations, and countries that are closest to being ruled by a monarchical form of governance, are populated by men who generally exercise greater authority within their families, whilst those countries that are ruled by far-left ideologues are populated by men who are generally negligent in exercising their legitimate authority within their families, because a true monarch is a man who is a man among men, that is, a true patriarch of his people, who has been raised up within a genuinely patriarchal society. See also, leftism, in the glossary, and chapter 26. Let it be known, however, non-monarchical rule cannot and will not endure. Once society has devolved to such a debased level, where it can no longer survive intact, the natural-born kings of the earth shall arise, and regain their rightful place at the head of each and every nation. Just as not every man can be the best guitarist or the best soccer player on earth, not every man is qualified to become the best ruler of his nation. The truth shall surely conquer, Satyam Eva Jayate, in Sanskrit. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. Proverbs 29:2. Attributed to King Solomon of Israel. The Old Testament portion of the Holy Bible. Whenever you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to pause and reflect. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, aka Mark Twain. American writer. I would rather obey a fine lion, much stronger than myself, than 200 rats of my own species. François-Marie Arouet, aka Voltaire. French writer and historian. P.S. This is an appropriate place to make mention of a potentially contentious topic. The above Voltaire remark replaces a quotation by an American spiritual teacher who formerly worked as a prostitute. The author of this soul-sacred scripture, was criticized for quoting a prostitute, implying that her words were invalid, due to her status as a former harlot. Firstly, the accuracy of any statement is not dependent on the relative holiness of the person making that statement. Secondly, none of the persons I have quoted in FISH, including the reputed divine incarnations, were totally blameless in all their actions, despite what many believe. Therefore, I have no hesitation to quote Voltaire, despite his antipathy towards the holy priesthood, towards religion in general, and towards certain monarchs. To be fair, however, the priests and kings whom he criticized, were hardly exemplars of the holy priesthood or the monarchy, to put it mildly. P.S. For reference purposes, the aforementioned deleted quotation has been included in the appendix of this holiest of holy scriptures. Furthermore, see also the glossary entries, capitalism, and democracy.